Point two is something I alluded to before, which is what actually is happening in this industry. And this is something to think about in terms of what the emphasis is, what's really important. Go back to my story about termination. The basic approach to policy, where you divide origination and termination, you let each entity have a price for what they do, and then because the termination, even in a competitive environment, the termination part is a monopoly, so you have to have some sort of regulatory intervention. Like you have to have the same prices for origination and termination, which some countries do, or you do something else. The crucial fact about this is that a system of regulated and/or negotiated termination charges creates, first of all, cartelized prices. But more than that, it creates an environment where the profit maximizing incentive of the firm is oriented towards termination. All right, because that is where you can make a lot of money. That getting people to subscribe to you is a nasty little competitive market, where you may have some advantages owing to size and network effects by covering the entire country, which would be the case of Telmex and Telcel. But even better is the termination part. And this is true in Mexico. You created an environment in which the business strategies of carriers is too much oriented towards termination. And that is an institutional creation. This is sort of the illustration of government policy has created a set of incentives that distort the business strategies of carriers. And it's not the carrier's fault. It's the institution's fault. It's the policy fault for creating that set of institutions. All right? Now, what is the solution to that? How do we prioritize that? Well, let's just step back and think about what's at stake here. Because we always have thought about telecommunications policy in terms, first of all, of voice telephony, and secondly, access. Because the reason voice telephony has its status is because there's so much consumer surplus associated with a very tiny fraction of use, which is use under emergency. All right, and that whole mindset. Gee, we have to orient our policy around penetration and facilitating making these high-value uses. Well, as time has progressed, that hasn't gone away as an interest, as an economic stake, but it's pretty much gone away as something of economic significance, because the price of usage, the cost of usage, is for those kinds of uses, whether it's voice or its replacement, which is text, the cost is virtually zero. And it's not going to be in the future with something that drives business decisions. That's going to be a simple throwaway. There's an automatic component of what is the main business of the network, which is lots and lots and lots of delivery of bits. That as time progresses, the fraction of utilization measured in capacity utilization of the network that's going to be accounted for by the things that have taken up 95% of the historical thought process of people worrying about telecommunications policy, that is going to become essentially unimportant, because it'll always be there. It's just not costly enough ever to worry about it anymore. And as wireless penetration approaches 100%, which it will do in Mexico over the next decade, when virtually everyone is connected, it just isn't worth worrying about it. It's worrying about universal service from the perspective of making certain that the poorest have access. That is important. But a focus of policy on voice telephony is now a huge mistake. The big the future is in digitalization for the purpose of using the network in ways that consume far more capacity than either voice or text, which are, to a first order approximation, free. Now, go back to our termination story again. In a world in which that stuff is free, having a regulated system that sort of guarantees that that continues to be a marketable commodity is a bad idea. In countries that do not create a business model to maximize profits from termination, create that as a business incentive, its usage is free. That is to say, if you look at the countries that have adopted the best policy, which is each company bills its own customers, but it doesn't charge the customers of other companies. That is to say, when a connection is made, whether it's internet connection, downloading videos, or whether it's a telephone call, each of the two connecting parties pays their carrier for whatever services they get from the carrier. Right? And there's no need for regulating a price at the interface, no need for any kind of rule other than mandatory interconnection, because each company is dealing only with its customers. At that point, termination stops being a monopoly, starts being competitive, because the termination becomes part of the billing process over which you use to compete for customers. So the business model of the company now is offer the best price-quality combination of everything, origination and termination, for all kinds of connections at various kinds of service bundles, depending on what the customer really wants to use their instrument for. They compete over what is in the bundles, how good the quality is, and what the price is. And you no longer have a termination monopoly. You have competitive termination, just like you have competitive origination, occurring at the time that the contract is signed for a service. And that sort of obviates this whole set of problems. And in that kind of a world, where we converge to is unlimited text, unlimited voice. And the charges are all related to all these other uses of the internet. The business model of the telecommunications carrier provider becomes more services that are enhanced. More use of broadband, more use of the internet, more use of downloading big files. Because that's where their profits now come from. And as Raul made clear, his work is consistent with a huge literature in the last half decade, that creating this kind of a business model for the carriers causes an explosion in the whole superstructure of industries behind the telecommunication carrier. People who are producing the content that's transmitted over the network. In the future, the primary source of human communication interaction is not going to be voice telephony. It already is. It's not going to be text messaging, which already in the advanced industrialized economies is declining. It's going to be social networks and internet web portals that are interactive and group-oriented. That is where the future of telecommunications is. Now you may say, well, what does that have to do with some rural guy in Mexico? Well, it has almost nothing to do with that rural guy in Mexico today. But wait until his kids are grown up. If you solve the problem of computers in the schools, you create a next generation of computer literate people throughout the country by making certain that your penetration of computers in the educational process is comparable to what the best practice is among countries at Mexico's level of development, which is somewhere between 75 and 90% of the schools teach kids to be computer literate. If you do that, in a decade from now, you'll be in the same boat as the US and Canada and Western Europe and East Asia. where that generation will be using the internet for, or we're using the telecommunications network for, is this entirely new set of services that I am too old to understand, and you're probably too old to understand many of them. But my grandchildren understand them, and that's what they use the telecommunications network. So how do we get there? Well, we get there along the ways I was describing, by changing the institutions of governance of the system so that rather than fighting over the best way to run a mid-20th century telephone company through the regulatory process, we reorient the financial incentives of telecommunications carriers to provide the telecommunications network that Mexico will want and need to be competitive by 2020, 2025. If you don't do it, you will no longer be at the top, among the top Latin American countries in per capita income. It just won't happen, because that's where the future is. So let's get back to our story now about governance. What is necessary to get there? Well, it is in fact possible to regulate your way there, at least on paper. All right? It has to do with unbundling rules and prices. It has to do with access price regulation. It's an intensive regulatory process. The problem with it, with the regulatory approach, the pure price and service regulation approach, is that it's extremely hard, not just from an engineering and economic standpoint, because you have this ridiculous moving target up there, where the nature of the uses of the network change faster than you can write the regulations. And so it's really hard to figure out, well, what is the right way to think about terminating access charges in a world in which nobody is making telephone calls anymore. And so getting there that way is